It's a sunny day in the Mojave Desert in November 2007, and yet again I am slogging up a long alluvial fan that looks a lot like this one with a group of classmates and our professor. So alluvial fans are these big aprons of sand and gravel and boulders that extend out into valleys from the mouths of canyons. And the alluvial fan on this day is not super steep, but it is long, meaning that it feels like we've been walking forever, and yet we don't seem like we're getting any closer to the top. The alluvial fan looks smooth from a distance, but up close, it's very complex. It's covered in all of these steep channels and gullies we have to scramble across, and there are also all these scrubby plants and cacti that we have to dodge around. Time passes at a crawl. And although we've been walking for an hour, it feels like we've only gone half a mile. However, when we get to the top of this alluvial fan and cross the final ridge, we come across the coolest rock I've ever seen. To know why this was the coolest rock I've ever seen, you've got to know something about ooids, which are a very charismatic type of sand grain. They are smooth and round and shiny and beautiful, and they are incredibly unique because ooids are the only type of sand that actually accumulate and preserve a record of all of the different environments that they've experienced during their lifetime as a sand grain. And that's recorded in the form of these series of concentric layers of calcium carbonate minerals that they accumulate. And that series of layers preserves a record of the environments that sand grain has experienced over hundreds to even thousands of years. Most of the ooids that we can find forming in different places in the world today, or that we find in rocks, are about the same diameter as a piece of pencil lead. But there are some times in Earth history when Earth's oceans made ooids get really big, like the size of marbles. Geologists call these really big ooids giant ooids, because geologists are very technical. And they have noticed that they tend to occur in parts of Earth history that are particularly dynamic and important, like just before these two climate events called snowball Earths, where glaciers and sea ice extended all the way to Earth's equator and stayed that way for millions of years, or just after the biggest mass extinction in Earth's history. This pattern of when these giant ooids occur in Earth's rocks probably tells us that those ooids are recording something really important about what was happening in Earth's oceans at these very dynamic parts of Earth history. But because we don't know what causes regular ooids to get giant, we don't know how to read this record yet. So the rock at the top of that long alluvial fan on this day in 2007 was the first time I'd ever seen giant ooids, and I was immediately enamored. Our professor made an offhand comment about this maybe being a good site for a student to do an undergraduate research project, and I raised my hand before he could finish his sentence and definitely before anyone else could volunteer in front of me. I was very excited to solve the mystery of not just these giant ooids, but all the giant ooids. 2 years later, I had not solved the mystery of either these or all the giant ooids, and in fact, I hadn't even come close. And this was one of my first times experiencing something that would be a common feeling as I would continue on in my career as a scientist, which is the disappointment of setting out with this lofty question that you're very excited about and that you think is very important, and falling really short of where you'd want it to get in terms of answering it. I hadn't lost any of my enthusiasm or curiosity for ooids, but because I hadn't applied to very many graduate schools, all of the opportunities I had to continue in my training and education in research were in different topics. So I reluctantly set aside my love of ooids and tried to throw myself into a new research direction with the same enthusiasm. That didn't go so well. I felt like I spent the first 4 years of graduate school walking up an endless alluvial fan, except this one didn't have giant ooids at the top, and I didn't even know what was at the top of it. I was just walking. I would go on these long Google Scholar journeys that are like when you open an article in Wikipedia and then you click on a link to another article and then you keep clicking, and then the next thing you know, a couple hours have passed and you have 100 tabs open and you did not answer the question you started with. Or I would find myself sitting down to try to write about my research, and I would just open my Word document and just spend a whole hour scrolling up and down the page, unable to find a place to start. I frequently felt lost. I worried that I'd made a mistake in choosing to be a geologist and in choosing to go to graduate school. The summer after my 4th year in grad school, I had the opportunity to take a break from my main PhD research for a while and take part in this 5-week-long summer course. We spent the first week of this course driving around in the Mountain West doing fieldwork in different locations. And one of the places we went was Great Salt Lake. If you've ever been to Great Salt Lake, you also know that it is not like many lakes. It's the kind of lake that you can smell from the parking lot, even when the shoreline is really far away. And on this particular day that we were there in 2013, there were these little tiny biting flies that were attacking us as we were trying to eat our lunch in the picnic shelter before we went out to collect our samples. And then when we walked out to the shoreline, there was this thick gray cloud that rose into the air in front of us. That's all these little brine flies that live by the lake shore and get disturbed when you get close to them. And then a bunch of the shorebirds would just walk through the cloud of brine flies with their mouths open to have their lunch for the day. But when you get on the other side of the brine fly cloud and into the water, it's really like entering another world. Great Salt Lake is so salty that you just float absurdly high in the water. So we were sitting there floating cross-legged with our shoulders and heads fully above water. And all around us, there are these tiny, bright red brine shrimp swimming around. You may also know of them as sea monkeys. During this time of the summer when we were there, the brine shrimp eat all the algae that live in the lake water, and that leaves the lake water incredibly clear. So we could see all of this beautiful, smooth, shiny, perfectly round sand that covers the lake bottom. And the reason that that sand is so smooth and round and perfectly shiny is that Great Salt Lake is one of the few places on Earth today that you can go see ooids forming right now. And on this summer course, we had come to this beach to learn something about the role of the microbes in this environment in contributing to these particular ooids forming. So that's the science I got to do for the next 4 weeks, which were exhausting but incredibly intellectually fulfilling. And after the summer course had completed, I went back to my graduate research with renewed enthusiasm to just get it done so that I could do something different. And fortunately for me, the something different was ooids, but, but this time viewed through the lens of experiments that I did in the lab, where I would try to get them to grow in different aquaria in the lab, and in looking at different places on Earth today where they're actively forming now. And through this new work, I finally had a breakthrough. I discovered that what makes ooids the size that they are is not just the chemistry of the water that they grow in, which plays a role in how fast those little mineral layers form, but actually equally important is what happens in between those periods of growth, when the grains are rolling around on the seafloor or the lake bed, and they're knocking into each other, and they're abrading, and they're actually losing some of the material that they'd already accumulated. And it turns out that this stop-start nature at which ooids grow, where there's growth, but then there's periods in between where they're abrading and sometimes getting smaller, is actually totally intrinsic to what they are, how they form, and how big they get. And something really cool is that as I was having this realization about ooids, I had the same realization about myself, that something similar has actually always been true about myself and my own intellectual growth as a scientist. And I think this is actually quite universal. it's easy for me to feel like a good scientist when I'm making new discoveries and I'm accumulating new knowledge, but those are separated by long periods where I often feel like the more I do, the less I understand. But it turns out that those in-between periods are actually completely fundamental to the process of intellectual growth. It turns out that those long slugs of alluvial fans and the multi-hour Google Scholar black holes and the floating in Great Salt Lake all prepared me to come back to my research on ooids from new directions and with a fresh perspective in a really surprising and unexpected ways. So now, when I'm feeling lost or unmotivated, which honestly I still feel like all the time, I remind myself that these pauses in progress are all part of the process of accumulating new knowledge. Thank you.